Good afternoon, everyone. And for those who are joining online, welcome and thanks for joining us today. My name is Ellen Kim. I am Deputy Director and Senior Fellow with the Korea Chair here at CSIS. Economic security has become a key pillar of bilateral cooperation between U.S. and South Korea. In April last year, President Biden and President Yoon committed to strengthening supply chain resilience in critical sectors and deepening digital and technological partnerships. This includes advancing policy cooperation and policy coordination on technology standards and regulations in key issue areas, such as semiconductors, batteries, quantum technology, as well as other critical and emerging technologies such as AI. Over the past years, two countries have made important progress through economic security dialogue and close consultations. But as officials from both countries noted yesterday at the conference, there are still issues that require greater cooperation as the two countries trying to find a greater policy alignment and export controls and other issue areas. So this conference comes at a critical timely moment to assess the current state of bilateral cooperation and identify areas of convergence and divergence in their both countries' economic security policies and find the common solutions for the future. Today, we're going to discuss two critical issue areas of economic security. The first panel will discuss about bilateral cooperation in semiconductor industry. The second panel will address the critical mineral sectors. I'd like to thank our panelists from the Korea and U.S. For their participation. I also would like to thank Korea Foundation for sponsoring this conference. With that, I would like to welcome our first panelist to the stage, and then please join me welcoming with our panelists with the warm round of applause. Thank you.
Well, welcome everybody. I'm glad to see an in-person audience. That's always nice. And it's good to also see, or not see, but know about an online audience. My name is Bill Reinsch. I'm the Scholl Chair in International Business here at CSIS. And it's a real pleasure for me to moderate this panel. It actually is a topic that we've been doing some work on. In fact, I was saying beforehand that Barath and I actually participated in a similar event on the West Coast a couple of weeks ago, so it's obviously a hot topic, and I know it's a topic of great interest to the Korean government and to Korean industry. So today we have two panelists who really know about this in depth, and so I hope that you'll find all of their comments interesting. I'm going to introduce them. They're each going to make some opening remarks, and then the three of us are going to have a conversation, and we will have time at the end for questions from all of you, and also, at least in theory, from the online audience. So if you're online, follow the instructions, and we'll see what we can do. And if you're in the room, when we get to you, just raise your hand, and someone will bring the mic to you, and we'll continue the conversation that way. We have, as I said, two distinguished panelists. Myun Oh is the Distinguished Korea Policy Chair and Senior Security and Defense Researcher at RAND. Previously, she was the Director and Senior Faculty Lead of the Korea Study Program at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, clearly the most distinguished international studies graduate school in the country, he said as an alumnus. And she also served, which is how I got to know her, as the Founding Director and Senior Fellow of the Asia Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council, which is just around the corner from here. We also have Barath Haritas, who is a Senior Fellow in the Project on Trade and Technology here at CSIS, focusing on issues at the intersection of national security, trade, and technology. He began his career in the Singapore Foreign Service, focusing on key flashpoints in the U.S.-China relationship, such easy topics as the South China Sea, trade war, escalating AI competition. He's also was a trade negotiator, was on the policy team for the late lamented Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I hope eventually the United States will be able to get back to. And he's also led the development of AI and cybersecurity standards in Singapore, and has led engagements with a variety of international organizations, including the OECD, the G20, and the WTO. So both of them know a lot, and we're going to open with comments from them, and then, as I said, go to questions. So, Beyond, why do you go ahead?
So, first of all, thank you so much, Ellen Kim, and Korea Policy Chair Program at CSIS for having me today. And many thanks to Bill for moderating today's session. Also, pleasure to speaking with you, Baraz. So I know that Baraz is going to talk more from the technology perspective. So I'm planning to. Is it on? Okay. I'm planning to talk on Korean perspective. And I'd like to talk about where South Korea stands now in terms of U.S. effort to build an ecosystem for resilient supply chains, for semiconductors through its industrial policy, more specifically through CHIPS Act and export controls. I know that also you're going to talk about export control, but then I think I can just briefly mention that the BIS implemented export controls October 2022 and 23, aimed at restricting China's access to advanced semiconductor chips and SME manufacturing equipment. And rules also expanded restrictions on SME to include some additional equipment, software, and technology used in advanced chip production. And you and I talk about upcoming, potential, export controls. So understanding how export controls affect Korean business is important for several reasons, I think. South Korea is a global leader in the production of advanced chips such as the memory, chip fabrication, with Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix accounting for roughly 70% of the global DRAM market and roughly 50% of the NAND flash market. So any significant disruptions or shift in this industry could have far-reaching economic strategic implications. And companies, especially, not just for Korean companies, but then global companies, including U.S. companies, specializing in more advanced cutting-edge equipment or chips are likely to be more heavily affected by the controls, as these are the primary focus of the restrictions. And additionally, I think this is more applicable to Korea's case. A company's exposure to the Chinese market before the controls were implemented could influence the magnitude of the impact. So again, really important to understand this magnitude and degree of influence of the U.S. industry and industries of other countries, allies, and partners. And then it is really important because to assess the policy options and choices for the United States on its continued effort on de-risking with China through coordinating with key allies and partners. And I think by bringing in Korean perspective, we have lessons learned. As many of you already know, Korean semiconductor companies have substantial manufacturing presence in China, and Samsung operates the world's largest fabrication facility for flash memory in Xi'an. SK Hynix operates 2 plants in Wuxi and Dalian, and which accounts for almost half of its DRAM chips production. So I would like to say that export controls represent an escalation in U.S.-China technology competition, and this has put South Korea in a difficult position because it faces the challenges of finding workable solutions that balance national security goals and economic competitiveness. While it is critical to keep the U.S. ROK alliance as a priority and then really core foundation for South Korea's foreign and economic and trade policy, South Korea is also hoping to maintain a non-hostile relations with China to prevent from any potential economic retaliations. And then let's move on to the CHIPS Act. And the Samsung, as you know, the U.S. government announced that Samsung will receive $6.4 billion to expand its chip production in Taylor, Texas, by building an additional capacity. Samsung said that it is going to meet the expected surge in demand from U.S. customers for future products like AI chips. And SK Hynix announced plans to build its first U.S.-based advanced packaging facility and research center for AI in Indiana. So CHIPS Act really create opportunities to Korean firms. They can advance supply chain resiliency by expanding manufacturing beyond Korea, as well as by expanding their supply to meet U.S. and global demand through friendshoring. South Korea also passed its own legislations in Korea to enhance supply chain resilience, such as the Act on Special Measures for Strengthening the Competitiveness of Key Industrial Materials, Part and Equipment, and Stabilizing Supply Chains, and the Framework Act on Supply Chain Stabilization Support for Economic Security, so 2 legislations. There are challenges as well. The CHIPS Act workforce training component alone is not sufficient to meet its goal. The gap in the workforce and specialized talent could impede the pace at which South Korean firms can expand their operations in the United States. And alongside export controls, the CHIPS Act guardrails might impose a ceiling for Korean firms in terms of the revenue potential. So it might contribute to the phase out of the Chinese fabs by some year, let's say 2035. I hope that we can, talk about this topic during the Q&A session during our discussions. So that's the opportunities and challenges with regard to the U.S. CHIPS Act. So I'll briefly talk about the areas of U.S. ROK cooperation really briefly, and then I will turn to Baraz. So I think I just talk about workforce challenges. I think 2 countries should address these workforce challenges. And South Korea still has limited capacity in terms of export control. So if there's a way the U.S. can support South Korea's export control capacity building, that would be great. And I briefly mentioned about South Korea's concern and fear against potential Chinese economic retaliation. I'm going to talk about them more later on. But 2 countries could consider establishing a protection mechanism against the Chinese economic retaliation for allies and partners. And more engagement with the private sector to facilitate public-private partnership, set up the framework of better engaging with multiple stakeholders, including trade associations and private firms are very important because in order to have a holistic understanding and then the role of industry and private sectors. And I think we can utilize the existing, the U.S. ROK Japan trilateral cooperation framework. And then hopefully I can talk about Japan and Korea later on. So I'll stop here and then thank you so much again and we'll turn to Bharat.
Bharat, over to you.
Hello? Okay, that works. Thank you, Bill, for the charitable introduction. And thank you to Dr. Ellen for inviting me and also to Dr. Mio for your comments. So I'm going to take a technology-first approach, so I'll be dividing my presentation into 3 parts. The first is, why do chips matter, especially in the context of AI? The second is, I'll try to pinpoint what I think the Korean advantage is, and I think Korea has quite an interesting hand to play here. The third is, what are the pitfalls and opportunities for Korea? So the first one, why this preoccupation with chips? Semiconductors have been around for a long time. We called them microelectronics before. But suddenly they've catapulted to the forefront of the public imagination, public policy discourse. And so based on a paper by OpenAI, and this was authored by Dario Amodei, who then went on to found Anthropic, what he found was that if you plot AI capabilities on the y-axis and increases in computing power on the x-axis, we see an almost perfect linear trend. So from 2013 to 2018, the amount of computing power exploded almost 300,000 times. So just by way of analogy, that's the difference between a Hyundai engine and a jet propulsion engine. It's not just incremental improvement, it's a categorical change. It's an entirely different realm of capabilities. So in 2013, the state of the art for machine learning systems was trying to beat humans at simple Atari games like Pong, Breakout, etc. And then the first milestone for AI was when they finally beat the top-ranked Go player in the world. And the AI system managed to come up with an entirely new and novel move. And you know, for Go, there's actually, people have written down, there's almost like 1 million moves, and the ML system progressed to a point where it was able to beat the top-ranked human player. And since then, that graph has actually almost moved up, almost exponentially. So as we moved into the deep learning era, we are estimating that from 2013 to 2030, the amount of computing power used for training AI systems will increase by roughly 10 billion-fold. And if you look at trends just in the past year, so ChatGPT-4 required 20,000 chips to train. Elon Musk, current AI model, Grok, has a 100K cluster. Meta is setting up a 350K H100 cluster. So the amount of chips being used to brute force AI progress is just taking off on a very steep gradient. So what do I think is the current advantage in all of this? So with training frontier AI models, basically what you're doing, you're trying to shove roughly 1 trillion data points through your data servers. And these are GPUs, roughly tens of thousands of GPUs dispersed across the data center level. So and the problem, or what has become clear, that there's a memory bottleneck, there's a memory wall problem. When you're trying to shove so much data through so many dispersed GPUs, it's increasingly important to have memory chips on the GPU itself. And this is where Korea has an advantage. So as Dr. Mion mentioned, they produce 70% of memory chips, but also Korea produces 90% of all high bandwidth memory chips in the world. And so the current limitations actually for scaling semiconductor manufacturing in the world are one, a CoWoS, which is for packaging the technologies itself, and TSMC is one of the companies that does this best. But the second one is memory, and Korea has a near monopoly on this. So we see a clear opportunity, a clear stranglehold that Korea has, and a leverage that it can bring to conversations with the US. Then the question is, what are the challenges? And I think, as mentioned, and I know Bill will be asking me some harder questions on this later. Obviously, there's the question on export controls in 2022 and 2023, and Korea did initially get a waiver on it, and I'll dive a little on whether I think how important or useful this is. There's also recently been an outbound investment screening regime, which prevents companies from investing in Chinese companies that are either semiconductor, quantum, or AI-led. And so we are starting to see expansion of the US arsenal, and it's for all the opportunities and leverage Korea has, it might get caught in the crosshairs of US-China competition. But I think I'll stop right there, and I'll let Bill take us through a gauntlet of questions.
Okay, well, thank you to both of us, both of you for that. Let's chat about several of the points you raised. The U.S. policy is generally been defined by everybody as both promote and protect. And promote is the CHIPS Act. It's a variety of other acts, some of which you, Myeon, mentioned. Protect in this area has manifested itself largely as export controls, although investment restrictions may be coming in as well. Guardrails in the CHIPS Act or protect. So I think let's focus a little bit on both sides of that equation in terms of how they've affected Korea. And Myeon, you started out, you commented on this, but maybe we can drill down just a little bit more for both of you, really. How have the October 22 and 23 controls affected Korea, and in particular, how have they affected Korean companies' production inside China? Do you want to start, Bharat?
I could take a crack at it. So I think export control has both hurt Korean businesses, that's obvious and intuitive, but have also been some benefits to Korean companies. So the real question is, on aggregate, what are the costs, what are the benefits? So on the cost, it's quite obvious. So before 2022, Korean companies, semiconductor exports, I think they sold up to 55% of all semiconductor exports to China. So China has always been a huge market for Korean semiconductor exports. But it's not just sales figures or revenue that's being affected. A lot of Korean production takes place within China. So Samsung and SK Hynix have facilities in Wuxi and Xi'an, and they've been steadily investing in China for almost a decade. So in 2022, just before the export controls were released, Korea just completed the setting up or upgrading a facility in Xi'an. And they have spent 25 billion over a 10 to 15-year period. So you can see how crippling this might have been. Of course, later on, Korea initially received a 1-year waiver from the U.S. export controls, and then later on, they were offered an indefinite waiver. And this seems like a great thing, right? But the waiver only doesn't allow them to upgrade their facilities in China. So why is this a problem? So for memory chips, unlike producing logic chips, for example, so most of TSMC's revenue actually comes from selling legacy or mature chips. And there's a business context for this, because if you're selling a chip that's going to be used in a car or in a missile system, this need to be used for anywhere from 8 to 30 years. So it makes sense that you'll have to continue selling them. The problem with the memory chip industry is that 90% of all memory chips tend to be used in cutting-edge systems. Because when it comes to memory, it's really about how many memory chips or DRAMs can you stack one on top of another. That's really what HBMs are. They're currently stacking anywhere from 12 to 16 layers of DRAMs. So you need to be at the frontier of this constantly, which means you need to constantly upgrade, innovate, and keep pushing the frontier. So I think it's inevitable that the facilities in China will become outdated in a couple of years. And of course, the US knows this. So that's one thing. Lost revenue market to China, and then your facilities will over time become outdated. What are the benefits, I think? So the good thing is that for Korea is that YMTC based in China had been catching up quite a bit to Samsung and SK Hynix before. I think they were projected to actually grow 60% in 2023 before the export controls. After the export controls were released, based on the quarterly reports, their revenues declined by 7%. So that was a good thing for them. And the second thing was that China's way of retaliating against China was targeting Micron investments in China, or sales to China. Again, the second biggest competitor to Samsung, SK Hynix. Samsung and SK Hynix have roughly 70% share. Like Dr. Mion said, Micron has 23%. So there's some upsides. They hurt their competitors. And then the next side is on the CHIPS Act. So yes, they lost a great deal of money in China that they have been shoveling into China, but because of Dr. Mion say in Texas and then Indiana, maybe it can offset. So it's very difficult to say on net what has happened. Obviously, Korea is being affected by export controls, and this is only the second wave of it and things. But there are also some opportunities here at the business level, so I thought maybe I would offer that perspective.
Agree?
Yes, and also additional point. So to really assess the direct impact of export controls on Korean firms, I think it also would require in-depth study, right? And then also may require comparison and contrast, with other semiconductor global companies, etc. Also, I think it's combined factors, right? So, and I probably want to mention the current Korea's trade minister. He recently had an interview with Bloomberg, and then he said that South Korea wants carrots from you saw the right? So carrots from the United States to encourage South Korea's more compliance with additional U.S. restrictions on advanced exports to China. And he didn't mention specifically what incentive he was referring to. And then I was thinking about what would be those tools, because obviously South Korean government and then also Korean firms are looking for flexibilities and incentive, I think. So you already talked about the waiver, right? So because of that, I don't think it has substantially affected the Korean business. But you're right, because so as existing facilities in China in terms of renovation, and then they have to, I think, also take into account and also should come up with short to midterm strategy in terms of what they're going to do. And then, so I think, via email we talk about, is it going to affect the bottom lines of South Korean firms, and then they're willing to, phase out or exit China. I think it's a tough question, right? And there are multiple factors that I wanted to talk about. So, according to the interview, he said that thanks to the negotiations between South Korea and U.S. government that allow South Korean chip makers to maintain their, he didn't say short-term, but I assume short-term profitability despite the multiple economic measures implemented by the United States. But you already, laid out that Washington, and then according to major media sources, Washington asked South Korea to tighten export controls on semiconductor technology to China. I think the overall trade on semiconductors between South Korea and China will likely decline in the long term due to various limitations, and that include U.S. export controls and potential Chinese economic retaliations, and China also becoming a competitor in this market. So some research suggests that these export controls, economic measures have led Chinese companies to increase investment in R&D, and also especially in SME. It won't be a threat to the United States, Japan, or the Netherlands. I don't think so, at least for the time being. But it could be a potential threat to South Korean firms, I think, and also increased cost of production in China. That's also a factor for China. For Korean companies are reconsidering or assessing. And I already talked about South Korea's vulnerability in terms of the potential economic retaliation, and not to mention China's retaliation over South Korea debt deployment. Also, South Korea went through the Japan's removal of Korean firms from the whitelist when the Korea-Japan relations hit one of the lowest points due to the forced labor issue. So South Korea has earned these experiences. And then South Korea knows that it is not a viable strategy for the country to rely on single market. So really learn the significance of diversification. So that's one thing that I wanted to say, that in terms of the multiple factors, and I think I already said that. Maybe Bill already just heard it from me. But then in Washington D.C. policy circles, there's a understanding that Korean firms probably will be a beneficiary for the long term out of these economic measures and export controls. But they should come up with a short-term and mid-term strategy to sustain their business and to continue their revenue potential. And just I am not in a position to comment on the upcoming U.S. presidential elections, but obviously, there's uncertainty with upcoming U.S. presidential elections and trade policy, economic, measures. You already talked about U.S.-China technology competition, and also geopolitical uncertainty. It wasn't a key factor for most of the Korean firms before, but I hear a lot from the business leaders from South Korea that Washington, Washington decision is very important, sometimes even for the decision from Seoul to run their business. So this geopolitical factor and all these multiple factors combined, I think overall trade on semiconductor between South Korea and China will likely decline in the long term, I think.
Well, let's pursue the long term for just a minute. That was a lot of information. The waiver has been extended, as Bharat has said, I think probably indefinitely. It has been extended indefinitely. Subsequent administrations could change their minds about that. But it also doesn't permit upgrades, which you both pointed out. That raises to me the question about long-term viability, because it seems to me if you're telling the companies operating in China that they can't modernize or upgrade their facilities, eventually they become less non-competitive, or if not obsolete. So is this is this going to force the Korean companies to change their business models And ultimately, is it going to force them out of China? Well, either one. Who
I
wants to
can
go?
do like a very minor business side and then give you some time to think, yeah. So, I mean, for the manufacturers now based in China, they have a problem. So we know that over time, these are going to become obsolete. And so you can do one of two things. You can sell your equipment to other Chinese manufacturers, but you can't because you don't want to run afoul of US export controls. And then the second, maybe you want to re-export those equipment because the equipments, they really cost in the sort of region of billions of dollars. But if you want to do that, you need to get Chinese approval for licenses. And the Chinese government might feel slighted and not approve them. So the Korean manufacturers in China are really in a bind now. Most of their what are becoming obsolete equipment are just being stored in warehouses because they can't sell it, they can't export it. So very bad, I think very bad situation for them.
So we already, said that the existing production capacity becomes outdated by, let's say, 2030. And if the current the degree and level of US-China competition on technology continues, I think the Korean firms have to really reassess their strategy in China. And I think my answer to your question is probably partially yes. Sorry that I'm not sure. I wish I could say like firm yes, but I think it's a really tough call. And your like HBM, like South Korea's market share, and I think we probably want to talk about Korea's comparable industrial policy, but also I think I can talk about like South Korean firms, even like between Samsung and SK Hynix, there are like differences in terms of this AI chips and enabling technologies. So Samsung is pursuing a strategy of the product diversification, and then their goal is to surpass TSMC. And because also Samsung thinks that it makes it more exposed to any major disruptions and market turmoil, and then they really try to mitigate their dependence on memory chips. So try to focus on developing custom chips as well as on leading advanced fabrication capabilities as a market competitor of TSMC. But unlike Samsung, SK Hynix, I think they are pursuing different strategy. They launched AI semiconductor alliance partnership with TSMC, and then also NVIDIA partnership. So really try to advance its effort on specializing in AI chips. And then I think its goal is to surpass Samsung in terms of its market share, as well as to expand its market share in HBM. So I guess the reason why I'm saying this, there are like variances and differences even when it comes to Korean firms. So I think, I don't have inside information about, company in terms of, their market strategy on China. But certainly this emerging technologies and related to AI and quantum, it's one of the major factors for them to consider.
Do you think maybe not the intent, but the effect of the controls is going to be to, and the effect of the CHIPS Act combined, turning to the promote side, the net effect is going to be to push them out of China and into the United States?
Can you say that again, please?
Pardon me?
Yeah, can you say that again?
Do you think the net effect of the controls and the CHIPS Act investment opportunities is going to push the Korean companies out of China and into the United States?
Certainly the trend shows that, basically increasing trend, Friendshoring, more investment, and then in the United States, right? And just decrease in China. That's a certain trend, I think.
Yeah, I want to comment on that, but Roth, you want to say something first?
Yeah, they'll probably, for sure, increase Korean presence in America to offset their losses in China. But also, if I'm Korean, I mean, I would still. So what TSMC does is that they've taken the CHIPS Funding Act, but they continue to locate their core R&D functions in TSMC, and their leading-edge production at the 2nm level will still be in Taiwan. I suspect that for Korean firms, they will still, of course, choose to locate some production in the US, but you will still want to preserve your golden goose and ensure it stays in Korea for security, national security reasons, less for economic, because you need to ensure that when the need emerges, the US will come to the aid to preserve its golden goose. That's my suspicion, yeah.
I was just going to insert a small rant here because it came up yesterday at the Commerce Department Supply Chain Summit. And I'm going to do my weekly column on this. To me, foreign companies investing in the United States is not friendshoring, that's onshoring. Yeah. Friendshoring is that we do something in common with them. We buy their products, they buy our products, and or we mutually invest. So I would say that, I mean, the U.S. policy seems to be onshoring in any event, and not just about this, not just in this sector, in many sectors. The examples that came up at the supply chain summer actually had nothing to do with semiconductors at all, but it does seem to be a larger strategy. So related to that, turning to Korean investment here in the CHIPS Act, you mentioned in passing workforce challenges. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? What are they and how serious a problem is it?
So SK Hynix, so they have a partnership with Purdue University, especially to facilitate training on like semiconductors. And what I heard from the business people, especially from Korean companies, let's say the factories, the construction is ended like certain years, and then what if they don't have capacity to hire like XYZ number of experts to run the facilities. So basically we are talking about meeting certain goal in terms of workforce and talented people. And to meet that goal, I think both US and South Korea, and also along with other allies and partners, they need more resources. And here, probably we can talk about like R&D, that for us, I know that you also have something more to share, but that's what I can say.
I think the workforce challenges are quite severe. I mean, like, it's a matter of what are your talent funnels into the industry. So if you look at TSMC in Taiwan, from the top engineering graduates from the premier universities in Taiwan, they all joined TSMC. And importantly, when Maury Chung came to MIT last year, I think when he talked about what he thought made TSMC so competitive, it all came back to labor and workforce. So the first thing he said was that TSMC's labor attrition rates year on year were less than 5%. When he was at Texas Instruments, it was anywhere from 15 to 25%. So TSMC managed to attract both engineers and technicians. Everyone only talks about engineers, but when you are operating a huge fab, a clean room, you need a whole lot of technicians. And what he felt that because they retained talent for so long, they were able to accumulate so much institutional knowledge, and over time, the accumulated knowledge is what led to cost efficiencies. And so attracting talent initially seems difficult, and how many engineers or graduates from top US schools will want to put on a hazmat suit and work in Arizona instead of joining a Meta or Google or OpenAI? So the talent attraction problem is difficult, and then retaining them for a long period of time is also challenging. And historically, I don't think, culturally, that's not been the trend in the US. And so I think immigration is key. And so I think working, and I know it's very difficult for Korea to get STEM visas, for example. This has been something that has been in stasis for 10 years. So I think that over time they will recognize that it's difficult to attract and retain talent, especially when you're working in a desert in Arizona.
Is the problem engineers or technicians or both?
Both, I think so. But I guess if you're talking about top engineering talent, I guess for them, what are the incentive structures? And Bill, you've heard me tell this story many times because so I was a teaching fellow at an engineering school in Boston, and at the end of the module, I asked the 70-year PhD graduates, they just defended their thesis, and I said, like, how many of you are going to join Intel or TSMC? And they laughed at me because they said they're going to join Jane Street and they're going to do high-speed quant trading because their starting salaries are $500,000, and with bonuses that tips them over the $1 million salary range. So why join TSMC? And they always say that engineers in TSMC are the smartest people in the world, but also the most poorly paid. And so I think that's part of the problem, attracting top engineering talent, and instead of them joining like McKinsey or IB or that's a US problem.
And also, I don't think it's just a U.S. problem. Also, same goes to South Korea, and they have K-belt strategy, K semiconductor belt strategy, and also, which is alternative to U.S. CHIPS Act. And then it's really aiming to double national semiconductor production by 2030, but also not just R&D investment, but then it has a specific goal in terms of the workforce. So I guess it's not just a problem for the United States.
Are there other challenges for Korean companies in the United States besides workforce? Don't all go at once.
I think it's, if you don't mind, I know that this panel is on semiconductors, and then maybe I can talk from a broader and then higher level of discussions. And when there's a discussion on semiconductors, and that it tends to come with the EV batteries, right? And that's the area where South Korean companies also invest a lot. And I also like to hear your view on like onshoring as well. But my point is, so when I think still South Korean firms and then stakeholders from other companies that are neighbors of China, they tend to ask these questions. What do you think about this U.S. policy on de-risking? Is there a major difference between decoupling and then de-risking? And how long it will continue, and how they should view this trend? And then is it really bipartisan? How it's going to be changed along with the U.S. elections? And especially for the firm, they have major productions and factory lines in swing states. I think that's one of the major factors for them to think about in terms of sustainability. This new trade protectionism and economic measures, and is it a really long-term thing? So I know that this is again very high level. But,
No, but it's important. You're right, it gets beyond semiconductors, but when I give talks about this, the question often comes up, what do companies think about when they're making investments? Mm-hmm. And most often it's other countries wanting to know what American companies think about when they're making foreign investments, but the issue equally applies the other direction. What do foreign companies think about when they're considering investments into the United States? And we don't often talk about that here. There's just some assumption that everybody wants to invest in the United States, but I'm not sure that is still accurate. But I think that what I've said about it in the past, I think holds for inbound investment as well as outbound investment, that the big things companies look for are rule of law, which is not really a U.S. problem, policy stability, which is really what you refer to, which is how confident is the company that policy next year or the year after is going to be not dramatically different from what it is now. And the third, because commercial disputes are inevitable in any context, in any sector, is there a dispute resolution process that is transparent, objective, and efficient? And companies all, I think, look for those three things. And you're quite right about the policy stability point, particularly right now in the United States. There are concerns that, a change in administrations might produce significantly different policies. Yet the Korean government, the Korean companies are going ahead anyway. But let me, since we started looking at this from both perspectives, let me turn the question around. Start with you, Myeon. What is the Korean government thinking about sort of its own industrial policy in the semiconductor sector? What is it doing about government investment, and what is it doing with its own relations with SK Hynix and Samsung, for example?
I mean, yeah, I'm not, I'm not working for the Korean government, and they represent their views. So if we read any, just news articles on Korea-related matters on this carefully, I think we see, repeated statement from the Korean government. This is a matter of the private sector, Korean firms, and then, this is, that's what we see. So I guess this is my question. So this is still like government to government dialogues and negotiations and actions, right? And then we have this stakeholders. Basically we can talk about working groups, try to engage more with the different stakeholders. I think I mentioned briefly like trade associations and then different interest groups, etc. So right now, so the U.S.-led effort tried to create the ecosystem. I don't think we no longer talk about like techno-democracy or something, but then the build the ecosystem to enhance the resiliency for the supply chains of technologies that are critical to national security. So this, I think this is a really long-term task that will require a specific policy roadmap, which is not easy, which is very challenging. I really do think so. So we're really looking at the puzzles and then really putting, pieces by piece and the role of the government and then government to government dialogue, but then different, players and private sectors and others. So how we can have a, win, and then how we're able to have a full picture, through the close coordination, I think that's we're aiming. And then South Korea's role is very critical, and due to all the reasons that Baraz talked about, so without close coordination and then active participation of South Korea, it's not easy, right? It's not even, probably not possible. So I guess, I hope that answers your question. And then to point out really quickly, I don't think I explained why I mentioned the EV batteries, because I think, please correct me if I'm wrong, but at least I think that it's clear, pretty clear when it comes to semiconductor, but then it is less clear in terms of policy on EV batteries. So that's why I mentioned that, which I didn't say that.
Barath, coming back to you, can you say a little bit about the possibility of joint R&D projects between Korean companies and American companies? Is cooperation in this sector, is this feasible?
Yeah, I think it's a matter of scoping it. So you can't reasonably expect Korea to collaborate with the US on research that might allow it to supplant SK Hynix or Samsung on HBMs. And the reverse is true. Like, you won't expect them to collaborate with NVIDIA to collaborate with competitive countries so that it will lose its market share. But what are some things where their strengths are complementary? And then the second thing is, where are there some foundational horizontal areas you can cooperate on? And these tend to be at the sort of pre-competitive research step. So the first one, what are some complementary strengths? The US does a lot of design, the software, and this is what NVIDIA is famous for. And then now the challenge is that how do we fit? So when we talk about semiconductors, we always talk about miniaturization of chips. We keep thinking they're getting smaller and smaller. Actually, that's not true. They're actually getting larger. People talking about mega chips. So the current sort of business models, how can we fit more and more memory logic dies onto the same GPU? And so what are some areas for cooperation on this? I think like The Blackwell chip is significantly bigger than H100 chip, and we expect this trend to continue. So like in terms of designing AI-specific architecture, maybe there's room for cooperation for both Korea and US to think how do we sort of do this better. The second one is that as the amount of computing power increase, the amount of energy required at the sort of data center level is also going to increase. Is there a way we can come up with more energy efficient chips? And this will be true for both memory and logic chips. So that's another area. The third one, I think, is on trusted chips, and that's a bit of a loose term, but how do we sort of better at the hardware level incorporate better cybersecurity protections? So in summary, so like in areas where each country has a monopoly is particularly competitive, that there probably are not other areas for joint R&D, but where the strengths are complementary and they both can benefit equally. And then on certain foundational horizontal sort of areas, I think there's a lot of scope for joint R&D, and there's money clearly being thrown behind it. And if you can do it, and some sort of examples was like IMEC, which is the Inter-University Microelectronics Center. This was initially founded in Belgium, and then they started collaborating with up to 14 countries, and they did a lot of work that advanced sort of reductions in semiconductor manufacturing costs. There's been SEMATEC, which is a Semiconductor Manufacturing Technology Consortium. That's another example. And then the US also has a trusted foundry model. And so if US, Korean companies, for example, meet certain hardware cybersecurity requirements, you joined this trusted foundry list. So I think there's a great deal of scope for cooperation. I think a lot of people are thinking about competition, and it seems like it's very zero-sum, but I don't agree.
So related to that, you said the magic word at one point, complementary. Where do in the sector, where do the two countries' capabilities compete with each other, and where do they complement each other?
I think on the competitive side, I mean, Samsung does a little bit of everything. So they also do production of, I mean, they try to the extent possible to compete with TSMC. The US is a little more specialized. They do mostly the designing or electronic design software. That's what NVIDIA does, which is a great business model, by the way. The profit margins are almost 80, 90%. And then you let semiconductor manufacturing industries in Asia do the hard, brutal work of producing them. So EDA, near monopoly, they produce some chips, they both produce some chips. Korea does mostly memory. So I think they're not really competing with each other. So I think they're fairly complementary. And then in terms of where their strengths, I think both very high R&D intensive industries. And I think Korea also has its own very strong world-class universities, research consortiums. The US does as well. There's a large sort of Korean population in the West Coast. There have already been collaborations between universities like the UCs in the West Coast and Korean universities. So I feel there's ample ground for more cooperation on both sides.
Okay, let's, we're getting to the point, time for your questions. Let's take a step back to the bigger picture on semiconductors and cooperation, which raises the three big questions. What does the US need to do to promote more cooperation? What does Korea need to do? And what can both of the countries do together? So Barath, you want to start about what the US needs to do?
I guess the perspective from ally countries or maybe third countries is that they feel like they're being strong-armed or bullied into agreeing to certain, and this is because the US has just moved a lot faster than other countries. The US has been clear on what the objectives are, what are the imperatives of technological competition, what do we need to preserve and grow our technological edge in AI, quantum, semiconductors. And so it started forming all these little mini bilaterals, trilaterals with Korea, the Chip 4 alliance, but it tends to negotiate in fairly smaller groups. And this is good for the US because it gives them better negotiating leverage. I think the US, and the idea of carrots, I think that you mentioned, I think a lot of allies are feeling like they're being asked to do a whole lot more. There's so much regulatory burden, compliance costs, but what is in it for them? So I think being able to match those incentives or those carrots with what you're asking for. And I think maybe just briefly on the Korean side, and this won't touch on, I guess I feel like, especially someone from Asia, if we can do a better job of coordinating. So I mean, and I've told some friends from Europe that you're currently probably in the weakest negotiating leverage you've had just because of the front in Ukraine, the security dependence. So you're getting picked off by the US one by one. And countries in Asia as well sometimes don't do a good job of talking to and coordinating each other. I think if you have a better collective bargaining position, then especially on issues like export controls and investment screening, maybe you can negotiate a little better. And on the US side, maybe throw a little carrots every now and then to pull the allies in.
we should talk about carrots. But first over to Myeon. Can you add to that comment on what you think the U.S. needs to do, but also what Korea needs to do to enhance cooperation?
Sure. So I mentioned briefly during my opening remarks that if there's a support from the U.S. government or United States overall in terms of facilitating and helping South Korea's export controls capacity building. With the support, I think South Korea should do a proactive role in this new regime of export controls, I think. And are we talking about deeper level of cooperation on advanced chips like Japan does and the Netherlands does? I mean, we're talking about different things. You talk about, complementary, and then, what they're doing is EUV, it's different. But, again, so this supporting support from the U.S. government, and then South Korea should take a more proactive role and then take the lead in terms of setting up the framework with better engage with other stakeholders and then bring in the private sector voices to enhance the public-private partnership. I mentioned about South Korea is afraid of potential economic retaliation from China. I think taking the lead, South Korea together with the United States, and also using the existing framework, if there's a protection mechanism against this potential economic retaliation, to assure allies and partners like South Korea, there's a mechanism, and then if you do more on export control, and then there's an insurance mechanism, stuff like that. So if there's a mechanism like that, I think it'll be very, very helpful and useful. So that's, I think, both from the United States and South Korea, not just one side. So it's a two-way street, reciprocal.
Yeah, tell me a little bit more about your thinking about the mechanism. South Korea has been a victim of Chinese coercion in the past in other contexts. And so they have experience, number one, and a good reason to be worried, number two. How can the United States, in practical terms, help them deal with that problem if it arises?
I think there are multiple ways and enhance information sharing. The South Korea and United States, they already have agreed on the mechanism of the early warning system. So early warning system in terms of the major supply chains, but then not just with early warning system, but then that could lead to either stockpiling or inventory or even accumulated funding from multiple countries. I don't know. A while ago, at the beginning of the Biden administration, I wrote a piece on this, and then maybe when by the time there was active discussions of IPEF, so I actually suggested that maybe these member countries can utilize this framework of IPEF in terms of the protection mechanism. But I think there are multiple ways and tools, which is also not easy, challenging, but that's what I can say.
Short commercial here. The CSIS economics program a couple of years ago did a study specifically on this question. It was not Korea specific, it was not semiconductor specific. It was about how do you deal with economic coercion. And they actually recommended several of the things you just mentioned. Stockpiling being one, and early warning being another one. So there is a framework for dealing with the problem, and it leads into the really sort of the last big question, which is what can the countries do together? And that's a classic example of it. Bharath, are there other things you can add to what the countries are able to do together?
Yeah, I think the obvious area would be sort of in that sort of critical mineral space. And so, Korea is a problem because before this, I think 95% of all critical minerals were imported. And I think the majority of them from China. Also, when we talk about critical minerals, I think it's important to distinguish between critical minerals for EVs and then for semiconductors, because those, for the latter, is probably things like gallium, arsenic, copper. And so the question is, what does Korea need to do? And I think of in 3 levels. What does Korea need to do on its own? Or what is the best place to do on its own? What needs to be done at bilateral level with the US? And what should he do at the multilateral level? So the multilateral level is probably the easiest. And Korea just assumed chairmanship of the Minerals Security Partnership. And this is a consortium of 14 countries. So there's an opportunity to leverage leadership, maybe find ways to connect the dots in IPEF, I think. But of course, we must be realistic. IPEF has not been it's been a fairly soft agreement so far, and I think it's been disappointing to many allies in terms of what is done and what is not done. But then at the bilateral level with the US, so what should you do? What are things that are better to do with a partner instead of yourself? So one of these things, I think, joint investments. So a lot of critical minerals tend to be in countries like Africa, like Tanzania, Mozambique, South America. But what the problem then with investing in mines is that this is a multi-year process. This will cost billions of dollars. And even if you get some amount of geopolitical insurance, it probably might not fully cover what happens if the whole thing goes kaput. So maybe sharing sort of insurance risk with another country in certain countries, I think that's the best way to do it. Both Korea and the US are fairly wealthy countries. I think these are things they can do well. So when I think of things you do at the bilateral level, what are things that, because at a multilateral level, it may be better to do multilateral stockpiling, intelligence sharing. That's something you do with many countries. What are the things that you want to do together? Because you both have money, you both have the same priorities, but also if you do it with like 5 countries, it's just a lot harder to close a sort of investment deal. So I think that's one tractable area.
Do you want to add
Also
anything?
on critical minerals too, and so I think U.S. ROK can strengthen its cooperation in third countries and Southeast Asia. I mean, that's also important region for both for semiconductors and critical minerals, and maybe we can take Vietnam as an example. I mean, not this high-end chips, but then also Vietnam could be a very good place in terms of, reducing reliance on, and then diversifying the market, and then production lines. So yeah, Southeast Asia, and critical minerals also, mining and production from Southeast Asia.
I'm glad you brought that up. That's an important point. If the issue, at least for American companies, fundamentally is de-risking from China, then that inevitably necessitates finding other places to go. And sometimes that means identifying capabilities that are already there. But in some cases, it means helping to create capabilities in third countries. And this is an area where both Korea and the United States could work together to identify those opportunities and provide the necessary investment. So we're at the point where we have time, we have a few minutes left for audience questions. And we have somebody, I think, in the back with the microphone, or maybe we don't. Yes, we do. So if you have a question, raise your hand and we will call on you. If you're online, use the QR code and hopefully the system will work. But let's start with the audience. Here's one in the first row or second row. Please start out by telling us your name and affiliation and asking a question.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Ju Young Hong. I'm the correspondent from the Seoul Times based in Seoul. Yeah, I have a question to both of you. Well, we are occasionally inviting the concept of alliance in chip cooperation, the concept of alliance. And Dr. Oh, you said we can use trilateral alliance in the chip security. Yeah. But as Dr. Rinch, did I pronounce well? Yeah.
Close enough.
Yeah. Mentioned, I think U.S. is doing the onshoring policy in terms of chip making because, well, at least they try to invite Korean chip makers in the into the U.S. territory. Yeah. So in this case, I only see subsidy policies and export control in the U.S. chip policy to cooperate with alliances. So without this kind of cooperation, what kind of cooperation is possible? Do you think? I heard a little about that cooperation, but can we develop this kind of cooperation into the alliance? Yeah, that's my question.
Who wants to respond? Yon?
So first, I think workforce is something that we can use this trilateral cooperation framework. And also R&D, I think you can weigh in more here. But also, so there's a working groups, established by not just the current administration, but then previous administrations as well on semiconductors, but then overall economic security. But then I think there is a way that this bilateral link to be expanded to trilateral relations, and then create a working group and information sharing, and really make as an engine tool to look for, navigate ways to expand the cooperation among the three countries. So working groups, workforce, and R&D.
You want to add anything?
Yeah, very briefly. I'll just think like, if I'm a business, what do I want? Now you tell me I can't sell to China, which means I must sell more to the US and other countries. So like, when we talk about industrial policy, how do we harmonize it? But beyond that sort of broad platitudinous point, like, can there be preferential access under the CHIPS Act for either Korean suppliers, and then the reverse? And then the second is that the problem is that the semiconductor industry is very cyclical. Every 5 years there's a glut and shortage. So if you have some sort of preferential buyer sort of arrangement, and that can help make up for the sort of peaks and troughs within industry. And for me at the industry level, that would matter most. Because if you tell countries they can't sell more, then there must be ways to offset those losses or increase their revenues. So I think that's one easy way, actually, harmonizing industrial policy. We're both doing a lot. You want to ensure that, again, complementing, not competing with each other.
Okay, another question over here in the third row on the edge.
Thank you very much. I'm Dave Yin. I'm a student at Johns Hopkins SIS. I wanted to ask you to maybe elaborate on the idea that the hands of South Korean companies are completely tied when it comes to China. Whether they are completely incapable of, reducing their exposure to the Chinese market. Is there anything at all that they can do to perhaps dial back their manufacturing or anything like that? And is there anything specific in this area that the US can do to assist with that? Thank you.
This is a really difficult question, because this is a business question. So if I look at what I think is the long-term sort of US sort of vision, is that eventually we are moving the direction of maybe decoupling or limited bifurcation. And so if I have all these facilities, what I can do is, like, you might cannibalize some of them, you might chop it up, like in a PE way, sell some of it off. You try to repurpose what you can for alternative manufacturing processes that don't fall under export controls. So I think this is what the business people will do. But I think the writing on the wall is clear, is that for the next 5 to 10 years, this is the direction of US policy. And I think Korean companies know that. So I think the reason they got the waiver as well, they know that you can't upgrade, but it gives you a sort of graduated phase out sort of time. And I think that that's really the sort of plan. This is almost like a gentleman agreement between the US and Korea. So they see the writing on the wall, they'll find ways to either cannibalize, chop off, or find ways to move assets that are no longer under export control. So I think that's what they'll do.
You want to add anything? No. Okay, another question. We have someone online, Minchi? Oh, no, we have a question here. Excellent.
Hi, thank you for your seminar. I really appreciate it. My name is Gina from South Korean Embassy. I'm not representing the opinions of the government. I just have some questions about the Chinese potential retaliation over the exports controls. So, as you said, it is kind of expected that China would take some kind of actions if all these export controls are enforced. China also has warned Japan of its retaliatory actions if all these controls are actually enforced and then taken in effect. And I wonder how the US is viewing this kind of potential scenario, and if Japan and the Netherlands actually kind of take that risk seriously and probably become less determined to or hesitant in cooperating with the United States to enforce these controls. Would South Korea will like likely to follow the path? Like what would be their implications? Thank you.
I can provide a historical perspective, and Bill knows because I've trying to research the history of the past 100 years of export control. So the idea of allies being not fully keen to cooperate has been a historical consistent. This was during the Cold War with COCOM. There's always the threat of ally defection. The US also knows this. My suspicion is that because we're in the early stage where the US has a stranglehold of the technology, it will force countries to do more. And because you don't have an alternative but to comply, you will have to. But eventually what happens, we know that technology always gets diffused. So what happens is that we call it the foreign availability sort of problem. So eventually other countries might start producing those technologies. And then when the US starts losing their leverage, typically the lobbying complex swings in the US and they tell them, please pull back on the export controls. But I think it'd be quite difficult. I think many countries will be in a difficult position. The US is in a position of strength and you'll be expected to do more. But I think historically, that seems to be the trend. You will have to do more, and then later on, you'll find ways to dilute, water it down.
The U.S., if I understand the question, the U.S. has tools to, depending on your choice of words, encourage or force other governments to take the actions that we want. But these are not cost-free. And one of the questions that I didn't ask, but could have, is the extent to which U.S. pressure on Korea to conform to our export control system puts them in a very awkward position internally, because essentially it forces them to go to their own companies and tell them they need to make some sacrifices in the interest of U.S. policy. And that's a hard argument to make, and in democracies it's a hard argument because people vote and they have opinions about that. So that's part of it. The other part of it is the incentive it creates for other countries simply to find ways to not have to use U.S. technology and therefore evade the scope of, or the reach of our pressure. Because if you're not selling anything that was made with U.S. technology or contains any U.S. components or materials or technology, there's really not a lot the United States can do. In this particular sector, that's a small universe of things, which is why we have a lot of influence over the process. But it comes with costs. That's, I think, the main point. So I think we have, do you want to add anything, or we're good? Okay, I think we have time for one more, if there is one. Yes, right here.
Hi, yeah, my name is Andy from Georgetown SFS, and the question that I had was, it was mentioned earlier that one of the opportunities for the U.S. and Korea to better cooperate would be in Southeast Asia, and especially given successful Chinese investment in semiconductor fabrication, like Malaysian packaging, for instance. What could Korea specifically sort of bring to the table with engendering a better cooperation with Southeast Asia? Thank you.
You want to say that out loud, bro?
Well, I'm Singaporean, so I'm Southeast Asian, and I'll try to offer the perspectives of the region. We have always been promiscuous when it comes to trade and investment. It doesn't matter, and historically we've always tried not to choose sides. And as a small state, Singapore particularly, we know that it's always fatal to choose between the US and China. You continuously court them so that they both gift you with and shower you with gifts. When you choose one, you get locked into possibly a smaller relationship. And so we try to do that. So Korea, I think, if they want to, I think Southeast Asia is more, they recognize that with the US-China tensions, it'll be difficult for them to maybe have Chinese investments to the extent they would like. And there's clearly some possibility for backfilling. I think Korea seems like a safer country. It seems like an allied country. So I think, especially for things you want to do, maybe memory or even packaging technologies, I think many parts of Southeast Asia are also hungry for investments, especially as the Chinese economy cools. So I think there's a lot of backfilling opportunities that Korea can take.
You want to add anything, Min? Well, we're at time. Actually, we're exactly at time. And so as not to run late, we're going to take now a short 10-minute break in order to prepare for the next panel. And I think there's coffee and things out there. But let me, I will thank the two panelists. I think I told you in the beginning that we had really knowledgeable experts here, and I think they've proved that today, and I hope you'll thank them yourselves. That means applaud.
So welcome to the second and final panel session on U.S. Korea cooperation on critical mineral supply chain. Critical minerals has been getting a lot of attractions lately because of many different reasons. And so I'm very glad that we actually have a chance to talk about critical mineral in the context of the U.S. and South Korea. We have a very distinguished panel of experts from Korea and U.S., so it's my great pleasure to introduce each of them to you. First, on my right, Dr. Kim Dae-yong, Director of Development Research in the Center for International Development at the Korea Development Institute, which is well known as a KDI in Korea. He previously served as a Director of Global Knowledge Cooperation at the Global Knowledge Exchange and Development Center, and was a principal consultant for the Myanmar Development Institute Task Force team. Over the past 15 years, he has conducted extensive academic and policy research in applied development and international economics, including case studies of Korea development experience. Since 2011, he has been in charge of implementing and coordinating the knowledge sharing program in many developing countries in partnership with the World Bank and Asian Development Bank and other international organizations. He has served as a member of ODA committee in the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Transport, has consulted other ministries, city governments, and public sector institutions in South Korea. On my left is Jane Nakano, Senior Fellow in the Energy Security and Climate Change Program here at CSIS. Her research interests include U.S. energy policy, energy geopolitics, global market, and policy developments concerning natural gas, hydrogen, nuclear energy, and critical minerals, and energy security and climate issues in the Asia-Pacific region. Prior to joining CSIS, Nakano Jane worked in the Office of International Affairs in the U.S. Department of Energy, where she covered a host of energy, economic, and political issues in Asia. And from 2011 to 2001 to 2002, she served at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo as a special assistant to the energy attaché. So thank you so much for joining. So in this panel, we would like to sort of understand U.S. and South Korea's strategies on how to enhance their critical mineral supply chains. So I wanted to ask both of you to take time, give initial remarks on, how each country approaches these supply chain issues and where they are coming together to enhance their cooperation. But for those who are new to this topic, so I would like to ask both of you to, during your presentation, explain what is critical mineral and why they matter to U.S. and South Korea. So maybe we could start with Jane.
Sure. Thank you so much. It's my honor to be here, and thank you to Ellen and my CSIS Korea program colleagues for inviting me. So let me start. I put together a couple of slides. Yes, here we go. So now that we're looking at this energy transition that's really touching all these economies, as well as really countries and the globe, we're starting to notice how energy transition is quite mineral intensive. Energy system that's less, I guess, dependent on fossil fuels actually requires minerals and metals to really underpin many of the technology components that are vital to generating electricity, for example, from solar, wind, but then also things like EV batteries. So the left top corner, a pair of bar graphs. They're just to show you that there are all these different minerals that go into different so-called clean energy technology components. And for example, the onshore wind plant requires 9 times more mineral resources than gas-fired power plant. If you also take a close look at the mineral requirements in transportation, that's a very important sector to decarbonize. The typical EV requires 6 times the mineral inputs of a conventional car. We're seeing all these different minerals that are required. And it's really important to also note that it's not actually just for energy, although my background is energy, so I tend to focus about on the critical minerals needs for energy production, but things like semiconductor chips, they do require critical minerals. Also hydrogen production components like electrolyzers, they also require critical minerals. So it's not just sort of the renewable-based power system that requires critical minerals. Of course, grid system requires metals and minerals as well. And really the sort of here the quick really takeaway is that until recently, literally like about 10 years ago, the requirement, energy sector requirement for minerals were pretty limited. That's the green sliver of those sets of bar graphs that you see on the right bottom corner. But that share is expected to grow, but then also the absolute volume is also expected to grow. So there's definitely more attention to critical minerals. Now, back to the assignment that I got from Ellen, which is to unpack critical minerals a little more, because I sort of jumped right into the why they're important, but what are critical minerals, right? So, here we go. There are a couple really key things to take away, in my view. One is that, there's no universal definition for critical minerals per se. Each country has its own list. There are a lot of overlap between what the U.S. government list of critical minerals and the Korean government's list of critical minerals. But each economy has different needs and different sort of supply chain vulnerabilities to disruptions in markets, relationship with supplier countries and regions, etc. So there's no really universal sort of a list or even definition, if you will, because there's so many both demand side and supply side factors that really define the critical minerals. In the U.S., we have 50 at the moment, and the Energy Act of 2020 defines critical minerals as a non-fuel mineral or mineral material that are essential to the economic and national security of the United States, which has a supply chain that's vulnerable to disruption. So that's one. And then the second really key takeaway about what critical minerals is that criticality is dynamic. So as you can see on this DOE assessment image or images, what's critical can change, depending on the supply risk, but then importance to energy. Also, there's also a forward-looking way that you can approach the situation. DOE has undertaken assessments and look at the supply chain issues and critical minerals requirements through 2035, and I definitely invite anyone who's interested to take a closer look. But let me sort of fast forward a little bit because I definitely want to get to the U.S. Policy dynamics. Whoops, it's not working. Next slide, please, if someone can help me. Sorry, I'm pretty low tech, even though I do follow energy technology issues. Oops. Well, we can keep going. When we think about critical minerals and talk about sort of a geopolitics as well, we do feel, so there's an important difference between where the minerals are from, like where the mining activities happen, but then also where the supply comes from, per se. There are a lot of countries that do have resources. Lithium, is mined and, extracted in countries like Australia, Chile, China. I'm sure I'm forgetting a couple other major countries. I'm sorry. And also, cobalt. It's the Democratic Republic of Congo is a major supplier. However, yes, thank you for that. The images. If you could please pay attention to the right bar graph, you can see that the supply really comes from very limited number of countries. The dark blue portion represents China. So what this really tells us is that even though there are a lot of different kinds of minerals are extracted around the world, not everywhere, but in many different continents, but many of these supplies go to China for processing, then in turn get exported back to some of these countries or exported to countries like the United States. So that's really the supply chain concern, security vulnerabilities that many of the policymakers, both in Washington and Seoul, have been focused on these days. And then I also then wanted to sort of share my perspective of how the U.S. Critical minerals strategy has been shaping up, both the evolution and development. And I'm not going to spend too much time, although I find it extremely sort of interesting to share so that we can compare and contrast with what our partner countries are doing. But it sort of started back in the Obama administration days when the Department of Energy under the Obama administration looked at the needs of energy requirements for critical minerals. But I don't think there was as big of a focus on supply chain security as it is today. So, but I wanted to definitely mention that because it's not like we just woke up one day and say, oh my gosh, we need to be working on this, this in the next 4 years. So this, happened in 2010, pretty much around the time that, China imposed unofficial embargo on the rare earth minerals to mainly to Japan, but also it did affect some of the importers in the US and also in Europe, but that was around the time. But then fast forward, we've been seeing a wave of actions from both the executive branch, the White House, but then also from the Congress, the legislative branch. This timeline is just representational timeline. It's not all comprehensive because otherwise we need like mile-long screen. But starting with the Trump administration's executive order that really tried to start thinking about the mineral requirements, but much more sort of a U.S. focused, the role that a U.S. domestic mining may play, that really was that really jump-started Washington's work in this area. Then, that was followed by another executive order by President Trump in 2020 that really focused much more on, I think, China as a sort of source of disruptions, potential source of disruptions to supply chains. In between, there was a Commerce Department strategy that was released to sort of organize some of the tools that the U.S. government has, but then also assess, the situation. Let me skip a couple, but then come the Biden administration executive order in 2021. That one, in my view, has focus on supply chains, but then also focus on this energy transition that's been going on. In many ways, in my view, Europe was ahead of the United States in really tying the importance of critical minerals to the energy transition, but then also your own economic sort of competitiveness or industrial competitiveness to the extent that Europe really has this ambitious carbon neutrality goal. But the Biden executive order started really charting the way towards much more sort of a supply chain oriented, but then also energy transition oriented framing for many of the actions that will follow. And I also want to definitely mention that what you see in green fonts on the timeline are the congressional steps. Let me just quickly say that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, so-called bipartisan infrastructure bill, that really provided, I think, roughly $8 to $9 billion towards, many of the infrastructure that are very important for the critical minerals. But that really was one of the first sort of a major legislative push. And then Following that major milestone were both the Inflation Reductions Act and the CHIPS and Science Act. The IRA, I mean, CHIPS and Science Act itself is really interesting and important, but obviously the IRA has a lot of international, that became part of the sort of a discussion between Washington and Seoul, to the extent that how we can collaborate and work together concerning clean vehicle tax credits, also advanced manufacturing tax credits. There are a lot of interesting pieces. Some of them, of course, I think we can visit and talk about it during Q&A in more depth. Some of there's some things that we're still trying to get better clarity, but they really are some of the starting points where both the Washington and Seoul, but then also private sector partners from the two countries can start charting steps forward. And I guess lastly, I only have one more slide. The United States government has a lot of tools, and some concern, some are more about the money side, like funding, and the other one category is diplomatic category. I don't really want to go through all of them. I mean, they're, I think, all important. So please, feel free to ask questions later. But there's some, tools like Defense Production Act that has provided a lot of money to domestic projects related to things like natural graphite, lithium. That's very much, looking at this critical mineral supply chains as part of the national economic security challenge. DOE loan program also, looks at sort of a clean energy related critical minerals requirements that the nation has. Development Finance Corporation, that is an important tool as the United States does more of an overseas engagement with some of the resource-rich countries. That's something that I think has merits a lot more discussion. Export-Import Bank also is starting to get much more focused on critical minerals than when initially the reauthorization came through back in 2019. There's a focus program looking at China and some of the transformational technologies. The recent, really I shouldn't say sort of a revelation, but like the really strong recognition is that all these 10 transformational technology areas all require critical minerals. So I think Export-Import Bank of the United States is another important player and a tool. The diplomatic side, that will take me to the final sort of comments on the scope for bilateral relations, but Mineral Security Partnership that started in June of 2022 is really the flagship U.S. Multilateral forum for bringing together like-minded governments that really want to help diversify the global supply chain for critical minerals, make them much more robust, make them much more transparent. And there are about close to 24 projects that have been identified, down from several hundred from what I understand. But looking at how to really actually bring together government players, but then industry, investors, and then now more recently, many of the host country concerns. Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment, that's much more infrastructure focused. However, many of the resource-rich countries do need infrastructure, like railroads, to be able to get minerals from where the mines are to ports or to the demand center within the region in Africa, or perhaps export markets, Europe, the US, and etc. So that is also an important multilateral forum that U.S. government has been putting a lot of efforts into. IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, maybe I just butchered the name. So IPEF is another important forum. Maybe we can talk a little more about it later, but it has 4 different pillars. There's one on supply chain security. It's extremely important forum, bringing together a lot of Asia-Pacific players. Many of them do have minerals, but also want to be part of the growing clean energy supply chains. get much more the downstream economic value add. I'm not going to go through the rest, but do I have 1 more minute, if I may? Okay, because I don't want to take away from Dr. Kim's remarks. But when we think about the bilateral scope for cooperation, I think it's very important to know that there's some some bilateral scope. Korean companies have been instrumental in helping really develop U.S. supply chains for EV batteries, for example. And that really also gives important signal to minerals companies, mining companies, and developers. And I think that's often underappreciated when we talk about policy. I think the investments that come from partner countries are instrumental. I also wanted to note that oops, so much to say. It's the Mineral Security Partnership that, obviously, again, started in June 2022. This year, Korea is the chair, and I think there is a lot of synergy, and I think there's a lot of hope and expectation that it's not just, obviously, the United States, and it's not just sort of some of the EU countries that the U.S. government has been talking to for quite a while. I think that's a great area for cooperation. Industry partnership, I think we can talk a little more about it later, but a lot of companies are now looking at opportunities to work with third-party countries. I think together with some of the U.S. funding and sources and Korean resources, I think there'll be a lot more that we can unlock. And last but not least, I actually also wanted to mention that it's also the vision that really matters, I think. If I'm not mistaken, I shouldn't say, but please correct me, but I think, even 2022 when, President Yoon rolled out his vision for Indo-Pacific, the formal name of the speech is longer, but I think there are a lot of the things that are so key to how the Biden administration views what's important for both prosperity and security of Indo-Pacific. So it's not just that we both countries have resources, but there's a strong alignment. Of course, there are some challenges, things that we can do better, but here we are, and I am happy to take any questions later, but thank you so much for listening. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. Allen, and thank you for Jane's insightful presentation. It's my great honor to speak today and discuss about our U.S. and South Korea cooperation in critical mineral chains. And by the end of my presentation, I hope that you will understand our cooperation between the U.S. and South Korea and enhancing our future partnership between the CSI and KDI as well. So I'm going to tell you about the outline of my presentation first. So I will be divide my presentation into 3 parts. I'd like to introduce why critical minerals in global supply chain and global economy, first thing in my speech, and second, and I will briefly explain what happened in the South Korea's national strategy and the policies of securing the critical minerals and enhancing its supply chain. And lastly, I will be discussed about our future collaboration in critical mineral supply chain between the U.S. and Korea. Why critical mineral? Now, I'd like to express why critical minerals matters in global supply chain. Recently, the manufacturing industry in developed countries is declining. With that, the U.S. and Europe are working to bring it back. And as a result, they are tightening export control of the technology and raw material supply chains. So the kind of the effort named by the re-globalization has made global supply chains more complex and complicated. So in this regard, China is also joining this re-globalization paradigm shift and strengthening the export control on critical mineral. So as you know, our session's main points, critical mineral, are essential for producing high-tech products like a semiconductor and battery and the climate technology-related products. However, the geopolitical distribution of these critical minerals, such as nickel, lithium, cobalt, and rare earth element, is uneven and skewed in the world, and both in terms of the reserve and the production. So resource-rich countries are not only nationalizing or weaponizing them, but also focusing on building a stable supply chain centered around their own interests and economic benefits. Despite of this, fortunately, the overall global risk to the critical minerals supply chain has decreased recently due to the falling price and the slowdown in global demand for the electronic vehicle. But I think that we need to keep an eye on this. As I mentioned earlier, the distribution of the critical mineral reserve and production can be unequal, favoring certain country. So the resource nationalism is rising in the global economy. So there is also a growing trend where the resource-rich countries seek to protect and weaponize these critical minerals. So for instance, this table, this figure shows this kind of their effort. For instance, in 2020, the emerging and developing economies implementing over 60 export control measures, and non-tariff trade barriers are becoming stricter and complicated. Next, I'd like to move on to what strategy and policies the South Korea had to strengthen the critical mineral supply chains. This Korean government has classified the critical minerals as those that need close management for their economic security due to the high risk of price and supply crisis. So these minerals could greatly affect the core industry and our global economy. The Korean government is closely monitoring 10 strategic critical minerals, judging from the 33 minerals essential for the core industry, like the semiconductor and battery, based on supply risk and economic impact. This table shows the criterion to select this kind of the strategic critical mineral. These minerals are crucial for stabilizing the supply chain in sectors, as I mentioned before, like electronic vehicle, battery, and semiconductors. Recently, on October 27th, 2022, the Korean government announced a comprehensive strategy for stabilizing the supply chain of the critical minerals. So I summarized this strategy on this slide. So this plan includes the kind of the point as follows. First is diversifying the imports from Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Australia and Canada. And second thing is increasing domestic mineral production. And third thing is building a critical minerals ecosystem. And fourth thing is encouraging private investment abroad. And last thing is expanding the strategic reserve and promoting the resource recycling, such as through the battery recycling. The Korean government is also working on the legal and institutional framework to further stabilizing the supply chain by revising and enacting new related law. So this slide is over Jane's presentation, so I will skip this one. And slide also shows the evolution of the U.S. national strategy and policies in critical minerals, so I will skip this one. But I mentioned that recently CSI report in 2024 has a very good implication on the economic security, so I mentioned this sentence on this slide. So I want to emphasize on one thing in U.S. case in this page. Recently, U.S. has also been building a partnership through the U.S.-led platform like MSP, Quad, ERGI, PGII, and IPEF to strengthening the supply chain cooperation and the critical mineral collaboration, while actively increasing the bilateral cooperation with the key partner economies. For your reference, this case study is based on my 2023 KDI research manuscript on the securing the critical mineral. So this table shows the key points and features of the major countries regarding the critical mineral supply chain. So refer to this table. Especially in addition, the EU and Japan's strategy and policies will be very helpful in strengthening the mineral supply chain cooperation between the US and South Korea. Refer to this slide. And I will move on to how we do to enhance our cooperation. The world has changed, but we may still be trying to solve all problems without its approach, I think. So it is essential to respond to the change in the international economic landscape. So we need to adopt new perspectives and strategy to match the changing environment. So I would say that we will have to enhance our global partnership and the strategic cooperation in this changed environment and global economy, especially in the critical mineral supply chains. So I think then suggest a more detailed and the focused approach is required to respond to the new reality under the global partnership and strategic cooperation. And national interest in securing the critical mineral is growing globally, along with the stronger cooperation and alliance. So, as I mentioned before, the U.S.-led MSP, Mineral Security Partnership, is a great example of international collaboration and should expand into a multilateral framework with the broader participation. So lastly, international cooperation has increasing to tackle the challenging of securing the critical minerals and managing the supply chain risk. So in this effort, the role of the development cooperation and the international alliance will become even more important. So this is end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention. And so if you have any question, and then I will be answer to your question and in Q&A session. And also, if possible, I will be distribute my presentation file later on. So for your reference, the KDI homepage and also the list of the KDI publication will be guided to have more information about my speech, and hopefully through this seminar we will be have a concretize the knowledge network and enhance our strategic partnership. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you, for the very comprehensive presentation. So it sounds like compared to our previous session where we talk about the semiconductor incorporation, where we saw a lot of tensions and a lot of works issues that we need to there's differences we need to narrow down. But here it sounds like we have a lot of things that room for cooperation. I didn't sense any of this divergent interest here, so which is a good thing. And to summarize, based on your presentation, it sounds like there's different forces that actually makes this critical mineral very important for both countries. One is the clean energy transition. There's these critical minerals are very important inputs for the high-tech industry, such as battery and semiconductor and other things. And also there's a U.S.-China competition. And we know that China has been imposing export controls on many of the critical minerals since last summer, which I'll get into that. But before I get into that, I would like to pose each of you one quick question. So for Jane, given your background in energy security, I would like to quickly ask you about how the supply chain risks in critical minerals are different from other energy resources like fuel. And then for Dr. Kim, I'd like to ask you, there's one issue between U.S. and Korea concerning critical mineral, which is the IRA, the battery resourcing requirement. So I'd like to ask you where the South Korea, how that affects South Korean battery companies, or how they're prepared, how they're going to respond to that compliance issues.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ellen. So traditionally, when we thought of energy security or geopolitics of energy, for the last pretty much 40 years, we thought of oil, how they are, transported from, for example, Middle East to the United States or to Northeast Asia. And that's very much, there was this whole, focus on the flow of the supply, crude oil, natural gas. The crude oil is easier to store compared to gas because gas, could evaporate. But there's the focus on the flow. When we look at, for example, let me just end, but in comparison, I think critical minerals, energy security discussion, it's not, so there are a couple of things, but one is that it's much more of stock. It's not, you can store them and it becomes part of the infrastructure. So it gives different types of energy security values to the system. And what I mean by that is that when you think of your, internal combustion engine-based car, you have to have access to gasoline or diesel if your economy is much more, diesel-focused. But, there's the supply disruption tends to translate fairly, quickly into price volatility or spikes, right? And then it really, you can see how much you pay at the gas station. But in contrast, when you think of the EV, the disruption to the critical minerals in a short run does not necessarily translate into what you do when you try to charge your EV. I think, the time horizon is a little different. Obviously, supply disruptions do affect prices of different mineral commodities in the markets. However, I think, critical minerals are roughly considered, I think, much more sort of a part of the infrastructure. So I think that's one way to think. But then also, the geography. I think critical minerals, again, the mining is done in many different regions and many different countries. But it's not just that. Like, you have to be able to, if you like sort of convert it, basically convert or process them into components that are needed in in much more value chains that are a lot closer to end users. And I think those are where the steps that the supply chain security needs to think more broadly, where the investments are coming from for not just mining, but for processing or even recycling. And that really affects how we think of the energy security and supply chain issues for critical minerals versus fossil fuels. I think fossil fuels is a little more straightforward. Obviously, it's not simple, but at the same time you have oil gas producers, and there's some trading companies as well in between, but it's probably fairly takes few processes in between where some of the international relations can influence the trading patterns and considerations.
Yeah, I think that with the U.S. IRA, significant change are happening in the supply chain of the critical mineral and the components, and further diversification is expected. So I think the biggest shift is the introduction of the law and regulation to limit the use of the Chinese mineral in electric vehicle battery in U.S., right? So in this regard, the certification system for the battery mineral and components are changing the supply chains and driven the IRA framework, including the subsidy and incentive scheme and so on. So since the IRA was passed, the global investment has shifted. So companies are now looking to invest in the North America, especially in U.S., and to meet their requirement in quarter. And they are focusing on the mining in Canada, Australia, and Africa, excluding China, right? So to secure the critical mineral like the rare earth element and so on. So and also the 5 critical minerals for battery, such as lithium and nickel, cobalt, manganese, and graphite. So in this regard, the Korean government is also preparing to respond to the new regulation resulting from the U.S.-China conflict, and including the Chinese export control, and also the U.S. the IRA scheme. So for example, the Korean government also negotiate the suspension of the FEOC rule on graphite for the Korean companies, and under the IRA, mineral origin will be based on where they are refined, not mined, right? So we need to improve the refining technology for the rare earth element and lithium and the nickel and so on. So I reviewed some of the article in the Korean press about the Korean major companies' cases with in collaborate with the U.S. companies. So in this article, the Korea's 3 major battery company, the LG Energy Solution and Samsung SDI and SK On. As you know, this kind of the company is a leader in this battery technology and pricing and marketing. They're aiming to expand their global market share, especially to the U.S. So in this regard, SK On is actively building a global supply chain for the critical mineral with the U.S. company. For example, SK On make and established a joint venture with the Ford. And also in 2024, the SK On signed the joint development agreement with the wastewater resources for the graphite supply and the battery research, right? And also the SK On signed the MOU with the ExxonMobil for the lithium supply. So this kind of the very best practice and the good example to collaborate with the Korean and U.S. companies, right? And also while the Samsung SDI, though the previously conservative in overseas investment, as I know, so is now expanding its product base, particularly in the U.S. With the major company of the U.S. So, and also the POSCO is also same strategy to expand their production of the critical mineral and also the produced EV battery with this critical mineral, I think. So, thank you.
So it sounds like there's a lot already private sector cooperation happening between U.S. and South Korea to deal with this kind of challenges. I see. Next question is, as I mentioned, the Chinese export restrictions on, starting with the graphite, gallium and germanium, and then graphite, and then technology related to rare earth magnet, and then antimony, right? So I wanted to know what impact these export restrictions have happened on both countries. If so, and what are the reactions from the U.S. and Korean government, if there's any?
I realize that I actually also sort of failed to fully answer your first question, which is when we think of critical mineral supply chain, really unlike when we thought of the crude oil and then sort of oil, gas, energy security question, that was very much sort of a Middle East perhaps, but now, of course, China is really the focus of major sort of player or, I guess, rival or competitor, however you want to call it, in this, on this supply chain security effort landscape. And, and so that also is another sort of defined feature. To answer your question, back in 2018, when the Commerce Department, following President Trump's first executive order, organized the strategy, it really, underscored the degree, both the scope and degree of U.S. vulnerability, import dependence on China. I think that, and I think in many ways with the 2010 unofficial embargo, it didn't necessarily come as a total surprise, but at the same time, both the degree and scope probably shocked many of us in Washington. And the sort of the, China's dominance on critical mineral supply chains, have been steadily built up over the past 2 decades. But whether or not, China would use that as a leverage to, push its own, national agenda or geopolitical messages, we really didn't see that in practice, unlike sort of one-off back in 2010, until really the past 6 months, 9 months. And it's been remarkable to see the specifics, although I think many of these things are sort of export restrictions. So there's like this, exporters, Chinese exporters that do want to probably export them because they want to stay in business, but they have to go through additional paperwork, and it certainly as, element of unknown to where the bilateral trade or their export may proceed. I think it only sort of strengthen really the Washington's focus on the need to diversify Also, I think I think critical minerals has become truly one of the very few bipartisan areas of work for the current Congress or recent, the Congress. And the emphasis may change depending on the presidency or who occupies the White House. But there is a unified sense that the current level of vulnerability is not healthy. It's also, I think, it's about the U.S. supply chain security, but then I think there has also been this greater realization that U.S. cannot do this all by, on its own, even though we have a lot of resources in places like Alaska and so many different states, 50 states. However, when we look at, partner countries like Korea, Korea actually is one of the very few countries that do have some of the EV battery chemistry, expertise outside of Korea. When I first started really looking at the current round of sort of the geopolitics of critical minerals, I think China had about 75% dominance on EV battery, both, I guess, anode and cathode manufacturing capacity. I think Korea had like the 15% rest, or maybe 16, and then the rest was Japan. Fast forward, I think even though I think the Korean and Japanese capacities may be increasing, China has extended its dominance farther. So the share, the sliver in the pie seems to be shrinking. And that is why I think the U.S. Reaction to all these, export restrictions also, really underscored a sense of urgency that we didn't quite see right after 2010, or not even probably 2017, 2018, when we first started seeing executive orders that, again, focus a lot more on, not just, but, like equally on U.S. resources, actually much more on the U.S. resources. And now I think there is as much, focus on what we can do together with partner countries, but then also in third country, resource-rich countries, and some of them are developing countries, as well as domestic resource exploration and extraction.
Okay, thank you. Let me give you one example with the EV battery global supply chain. So I think that this global chain is a small universe to securing the critical minerals. So I would say the biggest vulnerability for the U.S. and South Korea is securing the processing critical mineral, where the China controlled the 70 or the 18% of the market to the critical mineral. So Chinese company invest in mine with the critical mineral in developing countries in the Latin America and South Asia and Africa. And so China is strengthening their power in this region and countries. So they extracting and process mineral into the components before exporting them for use in EV battery. And China is the only country with a full supply chain for the EV battery, handling about 18% of the global mineral production and refining, and over 15% of the material and compound production. So South Korea, for example, they heavily rely on the Chinese for lithium hydroxide as 84%, and the synthetic graphite as 67%. So in short, China has a competitive edge across the entire EV battery industry and the supply chain in the world. So as mentioned before, its dominance in the mineral production and processing means that its export control on critical mineral have a major impact, global impact, especially on the Korea economy. So in this, in response, the Korean government plan to reduce its dependency on the specific critical mineral to below the 50% by the 2013, and increasing the recycling rate of the critical minerals from the 2% to the over 20%. So with that, I would say the role of the private sector in this effort is becoming increasingly important, and the Korean company strategies are crucial, I think. And I add one thing with a good example from the Korean government. So recently, the Korean government is continuing to enhance the strategic partnership, such as the MSP, with the U.S. and another major country, in order to secure the strategic interests of our global alliance, and has shown some result in this regard. So, for example, in U.S. case, recently related to the IRA, particularly the electronic cars, have reached their maximum level, demonstrating the effectiveness, I think. So, in addition, as I mentioned before, the Korean government and successfully negotiate a delay in applying the FEOC regulation, foreign entity of the concern, and regarding graphite to the Korean company, right? So I think the U.S. and the Korea should strengthen their relationship with the alliance and partner country with the critical mineral, and also they expand our economic security cooperation. I think that it is time to enhance our predictability and the sustainability through the unilateralism and bilateralism with the reliable partner country such as Japan, Canada, EU. So this point is already mentioned in earlier session. Yeah, thank you.
So I would like to take some questions from the floor. In case you have a question, please raise your hand. Michael will come on your way. And there's a question. Please identify yourself before you ask a question.
Hello, my name is Hyun Soo. I'm currently a visiting junior scholar from Korea Foundation, through Korea Foundation to the Korea Chair. Thank you so much for your presentations. They're very insightful. And while listening to your presentations, I came to think, so I wanted to ask, how important, given the history of the discourses surrounding critical minerals, how important is demand-side management at this point? Because we think about supply risk is coming soon, but as I understand, the recent price decrease in critical minerals was in part due to the bigger rise in supply capacity overtaking the demand at this point. But we are seeing the future to have more demand, and as a user of critical minerals in the future, I think we can think of interfuel. So interfuel substitution is intuitive to understand, but intermineral substitution is hard to understand because I think it's a yes or no question. So I want to, and if it's important, are we ready for this from U.S. and Korea's perspective? Thank you.
Thank you so much for a great question. If I may start. So even back in 2010, when the Department of Energy under the Obama administration started looking at the requirements, they actually really started looking at the mineral substitution as an area for R&D. And I think that type of focus was, not unique to the U.S., but I think U.S. national labs under DOE certainly started working on it under the bipartisan infrastructure bill, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act as well. It really looks at recycling, substitution, etc. But what really makes it interesting from much more of an academic view as opposed to a business view is that each mineral comes with its own, unique requirements. So, for example, certain mineral may be easier to substitute, but may be hard to recover and reuse. I'm sorry, I think some of the examples, I'm having little brain freeze, but it's not as straightforward, but there is a considerable amount of work that's actually happening, not just in the US and perhaps in Korea too, or in national labs, but also at the International Energy Agency, because the way that they're looking at this is in a much more comprehensive manner. It's not just about, yes, let's get more minerals. If you can increase recycling and reuse, it could really address some of the potential supply vulnerabilities. So your question is, is something, it's really, it's been part of it, but you'll probably see much more studies and much more conversation happening in probably coming years. Thank you.
I think Dr. already said the answer to the substitution of the critical mineral, but I think that the technology is very changing fast. So our Korean companies always invested to the this kind of the advanced technology to mining and producing this kind of critical mineral, and also we are developed some of the project with the developing country in the technology development, I think. So, and also as mentioned before, the Korean government is focused on the 5 strategy on the critical minerals. So one of the strategy is to diversify the imports from the many regions with resource-rich countries. I think the diversification of the critical mineral is more important than our seeking the substitution of the critical mineral, I think. So we must have a strong partnership and also the international alliance. And as under this cooperation and alliance, that we will be seek for another opportunity to have technology innovation to develop any kind of the critical mineral, and also that we seek for the substitution of our critical mineral, I think. So.
I was going to actually just say, I'm so glad that Dr. Kim brought up the advancement of technologies, because sometimes that really makes it hard to figure out. The battery chemistries are fast evolving, and so it's not just sort of the substitution, but even the mining process, yes, these are all happening concurrently. So I'm so grateful that you brought it up. So,
I agree, but as I know, some of the public institute invest this kind of the technology, and also the making a tangible outcome with the Korean company. So, for example, the Kia, Korean investment in we can believe that. But,
okay, it's late afternoon.
Yeah, Kia is one of the ODA implementing agency in collaboration with the Ministry of the Industry and Energy. So they are seeking for another opportunity with the Korean company in the developing countries. So they make some of the project with any kind of the government in developing countries. So I hope that this kind of the effort will be contribute to enhance our advanced technology innovation, I think.
I don't know whether there's another question. We still have 2 minutes. Sure.
Thank you so much. I'm Elon Sykes from the Progressive Policy Institute. And Dr. Kim, you mentioned that the strategy of South Korea in the mineral supply chain is mostly focused on diversifying, but especially in the share of refining from China versus all the other countries. I didn't notice South Korea on there. So what stages of the battery supply chain does South Korea currently really specialize in? And is there a strategy for that processing and refining stage in the middle?
Yes, thank you for your question. And I think that it's not my area of expertise, but I think as mentioned before, that the Korean government broadened our network to develop the critical mineral with developing countries. So we are diversify the region to cooperate with critical mineral cooperation. So I think I hope that we will have a tangible outcome through this partnership or any international alliance, I think.
I actually saw recent news that also private sectors, private EV companies are also developing, investing in technology, R&D, and so that they can actually find an alternate way to, instead of using a specific, all these minerals, they are trying to find an alternate source to fuel their EV vehicles. So I think that we are all working at the same time to deal with these issues as we are continuing to, diversify and then trying to reduce their dependence on single countries, stuff like that. So I think that's the current trend that we are going. But anyway, time is up. So with that, I would like to conclude the second panel. And I would like to thank Jane and Dr. Kim for sharing your insights. And also thanks goes to the first panelists for their time and participation. And also I want to thank Korea Foundation for sponsoring this conference. So with that, I want to thank our audience and also those who are staying online with us. So many thanks goes to everyone here. So thanks.